It didn't begin with ballots or speeches. It began with fire on the streets of Luanda. Before the smoke, a different kind of heat was building. Frustration. A city of stark contrasts, gleaming towers versus sprawling settlements. Life was a daily hustle. A generation felt left behind by promises of peace. The candongeiros, the shared taxis, were the city's lifeblood, their engines the heartbeat of the capital. But the cost of fuel was creeping up, a new weight on burdened shoulders. In July 2025, a change was palpable. Conversations grew serious, hushed, about the price of bread, school, and always, fuel. The fire smoldered beneath the surface. The city was a powder keg, filled with broken promises and inequality, waiting for a spark. The official narrative was one of progress. State television broadcast images of new infrastructure projects. Ministers delivered confident speeches about a bright future. They painted a picture of a nation on the rise, a post-war success story moving steadily forward. But this story felt distant and hollow to the millions navigating the realities on the ground. Their Luanda was not the city of press releases. Their Angola was not the one celebrated in international forums. Their reality was a relentless struggle against a system that seemed designed to keep them down, to keep them quiet, to keep them powerless and out of sight. The whispers started online. They began in private chat groups and on secret social media pages. Anonymous accounts shared articles about government corruption. They posted memes contrasting the lavish lifestyles of the elite with the poverty of the masses. Hashtags began to trend, simple phrases that captured a collective feeling of betrayal. Angola sem gasolina. Preço justo. Basta. These were not calls for revolution, not yet. They were cries of desperation, digital pleas for someone, anyone, to listen. They were the first signs of a network forming in the shadows, a community forged in shared hardship and a growing sense of injustice. This was not Angola's first protest. The nation's history was punctuated by moments of dissent. But something felt different this time. The anger was more widespread. The youth, who made up the vast majority of the population, were more connected than ever before. They had tools their parents never did. A smartphone was more than a device for communication. It was a weapon for mobilization. It was a camera to document injustice. It was a platform to bypass the state's control over information. The government saw technology as a tool for modernization, but the people were turning it into a tool for liberation. As July approached, the whispers grew louder. They moved from the digital world into the physical one. Small groups gathered in quiet corners of the city. University students debated strategy. Taxi drivers met after their long shifts, their voices low but firm. They spoke of a coordinated stoppage, a day when the city's arteries would be blocked. They planned to make the invisible visible. They wanted to force the powerful to see the consequences of their decisions. They did not know they were planning an uprising. They simply believed they were fighting for their survival. The storm was no longer a whisper. It was a gathering force on the horizon. The spark. A cold, hard number posted at a petrol station. The government called it a subsidy removal, a necessary step. For the people, it was theft. The theft of their ability to move, to work, to feed their families. The price of fuel was the price of a journey, now impossible for millions. The candongueiro drivers were the first to feel the burn as their livelihoods vanished overnight. It was an unsustainable equation, a path to ruin. In dusty lots, conversations turned to furious planning. They knew if they did nothing, their engines would fall silent forever. They would not drive. Let the government see what Luanda looked like when it could not move. It was a simple plan, born from desperation. A strike. They did not know they were lighting a fuse. The morning of the strike began with an eerie silence. Luanda, a city that normally woke to a symphony of roaring engines and shouting taxi conductors, was quiet. The main arteries, usually choked with traffic by sunrise, were unnervingly empty. The candongueiros were not on the roads. They were parked in neat rows in their neighborhoods, their blue and white frames sitting motionless like sleeping beasts. The city's heartbeat had stopped. For the first few hours, there was confusion. Commuters stood on sidewalks, waiting for taxis that would never arrive. The silence was a question mark hanging over the capital. Then, the people started walking. From the outer Musex, a river of humanity began to flow toward the city center. At first, it was just workers trying to get to their jobs, but as the sun climbed higher, the mood shifted. The shared frustration of the long, hot walk began to bind them together. Strangers became comrades. Their quiet determination morphed into a collective voice. Chants began to rise, soft at first, then growing louder. They were the same words from the hashtags. Precio justo, basta. The transport strike was no longer about taxis. It had become a people's march. The first barricades were not part of a grand strategy. They were spontaneous acts of defiance. A group of young men rolled a discarded dumpster into a road. Someone else added a pile of old tires. A broken piece of furniture followed. Soon, every major intersection was being blocked. The blockades were symbols. They were a physical manifestation of the people's anger. They were saying, if we cannot move, then no one will move. The city was being reclaimed, street by street, by its own citizens. The quiet of the morning was replaced by a rising chorus of protest, the sound of a people finding their power. The government was caught off guard. They had expected a minor disruption, a small protest by a few disgruntled drivers that would fizzle out by noon. They had not anticipated this. They had not understood the depth of the anger. They had not seen the unity forming between the drivers and the people. From the windows of their ministries, they watched as the city they thought they controlled was brought to a standstill. The strike organized by a few had been embraced by the many. It was no longer a strike. It was a citywide shutdown. It was an uprising. As dusk fell, the barricades began to burn. The spark had finally met the powder keg. What started with silent engines at dawn ended with roaring flames at night. Piles of tires were set ablaze, sending thick black columns of smoke into the sky, visible for miles. The smoke was a signal. It was a declaration of war against the poverty and inequality that had suffocated them for years. The fire was not just destruction, it was a form of communication. It was a message to the powerful, written in flames against the night sky, that could not be ignored, could not be censored, and could not be silenced by official statements. The streets of central Luanda transformed into a conflict zone. The air grew thick with the smell of burning rubber and the sting of tear gas. The sounds of sirens mixed with the roar of the crowd and the shattering of glass. The protest was no longer a peaceful march. It had fractured into 1,000 desperate skirmishes. Groups of youths, their faces covered with scarves, hurled rocks at the riot police who advanced in tight formations, their shields reflecting the orange glow of the fires. Every street corner became a front line in an undeclared civil war between the state and its people. This was not chaos for the sake of chaos. Beneath the rage, there was a clear logic. The targets were symbols of the state and the wealth that had been kept from them. Government buildings were pelted with stones. The windows of luxury shops were smashed. Banks were spray-painted with slogans of rebellion. This was a generation that had been told to wait patiently for their share of the nation's oil wealth. They had waited. Nothing came. Now, they were taking their frustration out on the physical symbols of that broken promise, tearing down the facade of a prosperity they had never been allowed to touch. The fire was a cleansing. It was a baptism. In the heat of the burning barricades, a new consciousness was being forged. Fear was being burned away, replaced by a defiant sense of unity. They were no longer just individuals struggling to survive. They were a movement. They were the children of the Musequis, the unemployed graduates, the underpaid workers, the silenced majority. The government had ignited a fuel crisis, believing it could control the outcome. Instead, it had ignited the people. And as the flames climbed higher into the Luanda night, it became clear this fire would not be easily extinguished. July 26, 2025. This was the day the whispers became a roar. Luanda did not just stop. It broke. The barricades multiplied overnight, like a virus. They were overturned cars and burned out shells of government vehicles. Nothing would pass. The people were taking back their city. Armored police trucks tried to push through the barriers. The resistance was ferocious. The youth knew the streets better than any map, turning the city's geography into a weapon. The state had guns, but the people had the streets. The business district was a ghost town. The city was severed in two. The government had lost control. It was a stunning transfer of power through collective will. They had done the impossible. The true power resided in the people. On this day, they flexed that power, and the city broke apart under the strain. Every revolution needs a center. For the July 26th uprising, that center was Largo da Independência, Independence Square. Beneath the statue of Agostinho Neto, thousands gathered, students, nurses, vendors, the forgotten majority. The square pulsed with chants and protest songs. Down with corruption! The people united will never be defeated. For a few hours, it was a liberated zone. Strangers shared food, activists spoke of justice and stolen futures. But the state could not allow this. Riot police encircled the square, black uniforms closing in. Tension mounted. Protesters locked arms around the statue, bracing for the inevitable. Tear gas canisters arced overhead, panic erupting as the crowd scattered. Police advanced, batons swinging. The battle for the square was brutal and one-sided. The state reclaimed the land, but lost the trust of a generation. The cry for freedom was answered with violence, a memory that would not fade. Night fell, and Luanda glowed orange fires from barricades and burning cars lighting the city. The protest's hope twisted into rage. Shops were looted, the violence spiraling beyond anyone's control. Smoke filled the air from burning tires, tear gas, and torched buildings, a shared trauma for all. News helicopters defied bans broadcasting images of a city in chaos to the world. The fury was raw, a release of years of desperation. Protesters attacked symbols of oppression. The government saw only chaos. In the flames, the people expressed a painful truth. The world saw Luanda's agony, unfiltered. The city's anger could no longer be contained. Dawn revealed the true cost, not in property, but in lives. Official numbers trickled out, but the real toll was told in frantic calls and crowded hospitals. 22 dead children, mothers, students, each a universe lost. Hundreds injured, hospitals overwhelmed, doctors fighting exhaustion and despair. The wounds were not just physical. Trauma haunted every home. Children's nightmares, families torn apart, trust in the state shattered. The government enforced silence, but it was only the hush of mourning. The price of defiance was paid in blood and memory. As the crackdown faded, a new terror began. People vanished. Activists and organizers were taken at night. No warrants, no explanations. Fear swept through communities. Trust dissolved. Families searched desperately, met with denial and threats. The term desaparecido, the disappeared, became a chilling reality. The government tried to erase the leaders, but made them martyrs instead. Their absence became a symbol of courage and brutality. The disappeared haunted the city, a silent testament to the regime's cruelty. Over 1,000 were arrested, activists and bystanders alike. Detentions were arbitrary, prisons overflowing with Luanda's youth. The legal process was a sham. Charges vague, trials swift and harsh. Inside, prisoners forged bonds, sharing stories and hope. The government aimed to break a generation, but instead created 1,000 families with grievances. The movement was not crushed, only driven underground and behind bars. In prison, resistance grew stronger, waiting for its moment. The state tried to silence dissent, but only fueled its fire. After the fire came the fist, systematic, overwhelming force. Armored vehicles and riot police swept through the Muzeques, punishing entire neighborhoods. Tear gas and rubber bullets rained into homes. Young men beaten in the streets. This was not policing, but occupation, a show of power meant to terrify. The city fell silent, fear replacing the energy of protest. The government mistook fear for loyalty, believing they had won. But every act of violence planted seeds of deeper anger. The old order returned, but the memory of defiance endured. The iron fist could not crush the hope it tried to erase. Once the physical rebellion was crushed, the government began constructing a more permanent architecture of fear. The crackdown moved from the streets into the digital world. The internet, which had been the nervous system of the uprising, became the new frontline. The state initiated a sophisticated campaign of digital surveillance and censorship. They slowed internet speeds to a crawl, making it impossible to upload videos or organize effectively. Websites and social media pages that had been critical of the government were suddenly blocked. The open forum for dissent was being systematically walled off, brick by digital brick. This digital crackdown was paired with a campaign of targeted intimidation. Anonymous accounts, widely believed to be state-sponsored, began posting threats against anyone who had been vocal online. They would publish personal information, photos, and home addresses of suspected activists, a practice known as doxing. The message was chillingly clear: we know who you are, we know where you live, and you are not safe. The fear that was once confined to the streets now seeped through phone screens and into people's homes, turning a tool of liberation into an instrument of personal terror and paranoia. Beyond the digital realm, the state reasserted its control over the narrative. State television, which had been largely silent during the peak of the chaos, now ran a constant stream of propaganda. It portrayed the protesters not as citizens demanding justice, but as violent criminals, thugs, and foreign-backed agitators bent on destroying the nation. They broadcast forced confessions from bruised and terrified detainees, who recited scripted lines about their supposed crimes. This was a deliberate attempt to rewrite history, to poison the memory of the uprising, and delegitimize the people's genuine grievances in the eyes of the wider population. The final piece of this architecture was the creation of a permanent, visible security presence. New police checkpoints sprang up across the city. Patrols were increased. Plainclothes security officers became a common sight in cafes, markets, and university campuses. This constant surveillance was designed to create a chilling effect, to make people feel as though they were always being watched. The government was not just controlling the streets, it was attempting to control thought and speech itself. They were building a prison without walls, where the fear of the state would become its own warden, ensuring the silence would hold. The fuel price was only a symptom. The real sickness ran much deeper, poisoning the very soul of the nation. Angola was a nation of two faces, a cruel paradox of immense wealth and desperate poverty. It is a land blessed with oil and diamonds, resources that generated billions of dollars. This was the reality for the vast majority of Angolans, the face of the Museques. This stark, brutal inequality was the primary root of the anger. The youth felt this betrayal most acutely. They were the children of peace, raised on promises of a brighter future, only to find a job market that had no place for them. This was not an accident. It was a system designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a small, entrenched elite. The anger came from this profound sense of injustice. The uprising was their attempt to claim their inheritance. Corruption was the poison that seeped into every crack of Angolan society, stealing hope. It meant hospitals lacked medicine, schools lacked books, and roads crumbled. Every diverted kwanza was a broken promise of healthcare, education, and a functioning state. People saw corruption, from officials' SUVs to million-dollar contracts for the elite. Bribes became the way to get ahead, degrading society and fostering distrust. President Lourenço promised to fight corruption, launching investigations, but hope soured as the anti-corruption drive seemed selective, targeting rivals while the new elite enriched themselves. The fuel price hike was the final broken promise, sparking rage against a system built on theft and lies. The July 2025 uprising in Angola was different. It was bigger, more ferocious, and fundamentally more organized, but in a way the government could not comprehend. There was no single leader to arrest, no central committee to negotiate with. This was a leaderless legion, a decentralized network that had learned from the failures of the past. Born from the digital age, its organization was found in encrypted chat groups, built by anonymous university students and tech-savvy youths. They used secure messaging apps and code words to mobilize thousands with startling speed. The movement was operating like a hydra, difficult to stop. The movement's strength was its lack of a center, a collective consciousness. The government was fighting a ghost, trained to fight hierarchies that didn't exist. It was an idea that had gone viral, infecting an entire generation. The Angolan state was built to fight a certain kind of war. It had an army designed to fight rebels and a police force meant to crack down on political opposition. But the uprising of July 2025 presented it with a conflict it was just not prepared for. This was a new kind of war, a war of symbols and narratives. The protesters knew they could not defeat the state's military might with rocks. Their strategy was to make the country ungovernable, to win the battle for hearts and minds. The transport strike was a strategic masterstroke. The burning barricades were strategic obstacles meant to fragment the state's response. It was asymmetric warfare, adapted for the urban landscape of Luanda, a guerrilla war fought by civilians. This was also a war of images. The protesters knew that every smartphone was a camera and every camera was a weapon. They meticulously documented the state's brutality and uploaded instantly, bypassing state censorship. They were creating a real-time record of the government's crimes. They may have lost the physical battle, but they were winning this new kind of war. In the face of popular challenge, the Angolan state deployed its oldest weapon, silence. As Luanda burned, the national television showed soap operas and old football matches. It was a surreal, almost Orwellian performance. The government's strategy was to create a parallel reality, a fictional Angola where the uprising was simply not happening. This wall of silence was a deliberate act of information warfare designed to isolate protesters. By refusing to report on the protests, they were attempting to rob the movement of its legitimacy. Government spokespeople spoke not of protesters, but of vandals. It was a declaration that their reality did not matter, that their suffering was invisible, and that their voices were worthless. This chasm between lived experience and official narrative amplified the anger. The great state silence became just another grievance. The state controlled the airwaves, but the people controlled the network. As official media fell silent, citizens became broadcasters, turning smartphones into mobile news studios. Raw, unfiltered information flooded the internet, bypassing government censorship. Short videos and audio clips created a real-time archive of the uprising. This was the people's broadcast, a decentralized flow of information the state tried to hide. Hashtags like Luta Angola connected thousands, allowing people worldwide to follow events. Citizen journalism challenged the state's truth monopoly. The people's broadcast, with its raw, emotional truth, contrasted the state's propaganda. This evidence became the primary source for international news, forcing the world to pay attention. The people dragged the government into the global digital stage, losing control of the story. The uprising presented a clear set of demands, a people's ultimatum. They demanded an immediate reversal of the fuel price hike. They demanded accountability and an investigation into the crackdown. The ultimatum struck at corruption, demanding real political reform and transparency. Finally, they demanded a future with jobs, education, and a stake in their country. The list of demands was a blueprint for a new social contract, a vision for a more just Angola. As the people of Angola cried out, the world was silent. While Luanda's streets became a war zone, the great powers looked away. There were no urgent UN Security Council sessions, no strong condemnations. The reasons for this indifference were buried in Angola's oil fields, a key supplier of crude oil. The human rights of Angolans were a rounding error in the global balance sheet. A crisis in Africa is often met with a shrug, as if conflict is simply part of the continent's natural state. Instead, they found themselves utterly alone, trapped between a brutal regime and an indifferent world. The silence was a green light for the Angolan government to continue its crackdown, secure in the knowledge that there would be no consequences. The world's silence was the regime's greatest ally. The streets of Luanda are quiet now. The barricades are gone. The smoke has cleared. The government may believe it has won, but this is a profound and dangerous miscalculation. They have not solved the problems that drove people into the streets, only suppressed the symptoms. This is the warning from Luanda, a message that echoes across a continent rich in resources but poor in justice. It only changes the language. It was the inevitable result of a system where wealth is hoarded by a few. The silence they have bought is temporary, but the anger has not vanished. It has simply changed its form. The fire next time will be different, but the warning from Angola is clear. Justice can be delayed, but it cannot be defeated forever. In the end, this was never just about the price of fuel. The burning barricades, the mass arrests, the international silence, all of it revolved around a cry for dignity. It was the demand to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued as a human being. The people of Angola rose up because their government had stripped them of their dignity. This struggle is Africa's struggle, fighting to free itself from internal corruption and external indifference. The events in Luanda revealed the brutal tactics that entrenched powers will use to maintain their grip. It is the indestructible force of the human will to be free. The people have won the moral victory, exposing the bankruptcy of the system for all the world to see. The story of the Angolan fuel uprising is now etched into the memory of a generation, a testament to their bravery and a blueprint for the future. This is Insight Africa, where Africa's struggle for justice cannot be hidden,